1789 till 1790 or 1791, I forget which, depending on the last date. Though embracing those three documents is what it means to be an American. And so we all understand and have heard of Americanism, but stop and put it this way. Uh, have you ever heard of Frenchism, Englishism, Canadianism, maybe Canadianism, okay? But what's embodied in being an American and Americanism is these three documents. And we're going to take a careful examination of all three of them over the 5 segments of this particular series. Embracing these three documents is what it means to be an American. At the end of the Constitutional Convention, now I'm borrowing, this is my copy of James Madison's Notes of Debates of the Federal Convention. This is the only relatively reliable source of what happened at the Constitutional Convention. Why do I say relatively reliable? Because he was not allowed to take notes in the convention. What he would do is go into a tavern every evening after the debates and write down everything he remembered. And then he would go check with others of the delegates to check and see, is this true? Did I get this right? Did I hear this properly? And these notes that James Madison wrote were not published until 1840. So almost 70 years after the Constitutional Convention. And we know that James Madison made lots of changes and corrections over the year. Were his original memories the right ones? Were his later memories the right ones? Were any of them fully correct? So, but this is the best source that we have for understanding what happened in the convention. And on the last day of the convention, the day of the signing, September 17th, 1789, Benjamin Franklin wrote a speech. He was the oldest delegate at the Constitutional Convention, 81 years old. And he was not well that day, so he had James Wilson from Pennsylvania, a fellow delegate from Pennsylvania, read it for him. He was trying to convince 16 members of the Constitutional Convention that refused to sign the document to sign it anyway, even though they might have had some doubts. So I'm going to read 2 sections here. And let me do this. Let's try this again here. Yes, we need that. And I'll explain that picture in just a second. He says, Mr. President, and that would be the president of the Constitutional Convention, who was George Washington, who would soon become Mr. President. He says, I confess that there are several parts of this Constitution which I do not at present approve. But I am not sure that I shall never approve of them. For having lived long, I've experienced many instances of being obliged by better information or fuller consideration to change opinions even on important subjects, which I once thought right, but later found to be otherwise. It is therefore the older I grow, the more apt I am to doubt my own judgment and to pay more respect to the judgment of others. Most men, indeed as well of most sects and religion, think themselves in possession of all truth, and that wherever others differ from them, they are in error. Steele, a Protestant in a dedication, tells the Pope that the only difference between our churches, that would be the Episcopalian and the Roman Catholic, is in the opinions of the certainty of between our churches and their doctrines is the Church of Rome is infallible and the Church of England is never in the wrong. In these sentiments, sir, I agree to this Constitution with all its faults, if they are such, because I think a general government necessary for us. And there is no form of government but what may be a blessing to the people if well administered. And believe farther that this is likely to be well administered for a course of years and can only end in despotism, as other forms have done before it, when the people shall become so corrupted as to need despotic government, being incapable of any other. So here he is, and it's a fairly long speech. And now we'll get to why you're taking a look at a picture. This is, of course, Independence Hall. Only one chair in Independence Hall is known to be original. It's the chair at which George Washington sat, the president's chair up on the dais. And Benjamin Franklin had looked at that chair. Apparently, the artist wasn't a very good artist. And he says, while the last members were signing the document, Dr. Franklin, looking towards the president's chair, at the back of which a rising sun happened to be painted, observed to a few members near him that the painters had found it difficult to distinguish in their art a rising from a setting sun. In other words, looking at the chair, Franklin couldn't determine, this is rising sun or setting sun. He says, I have often and often in the course of this session, and the vicissitudes of my hopes and fears as to the issue, looked at that behind the president without being able to tell whether it was rising or setting. But now at length, I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun. I happen to be a big fan of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln had thoughts on the Constitution, and he had thoughts on its relationship to the Declaration of Independence. Lincoln had a habit of writing notes to himself. They are called fragments. There are 110 of them in existence that his secretaries, Nicholas and Hay, found after Lincoln was assassinated and gathered them together. Some of them were thoughts that clearly got incorporated in some of his famous speeches. Others never got incorporated, and here's one of the most famous that did not. This was a fragment from January 1861, prior to him taking the office of president. All of this is not the result of accident. It has a philosophical cause. Without the Constitution and the Union, we could not have attained the result. But even these are not primary cause of our great prosperity. There is something back of these, intertwining itself more closely about the human heart. That something is the principle of liberty to all, the principle that clears the path for all, gives hope to all, and by consequence, enterprise and industry to all. The expression of that principle in our Declaration of Independence was most happy and fortunate. Without this, as well as with it, we could have declared our independence of Great Britain. But without it, we could not, I think, have secured our free government and consequent prosperity. No oppressed people will fight and endure as our fathers did without the promise of something better than a mere change of masters. The assertion of that principle at that time was the word fitly spoken, which has proved to be an apple of gold to us. The Union and the Constitution are the picture of silver subsequently framed around it. The picture was made not to conceal or destroy the apple, but to adorn and preserve it. The picture was made for the apple, not the apple for the picture. So let us act that neither picture or apple shall ever be blurred or bruised or broken. That we may so act, we must study and understand the points of danger. So it was no accident at Gettysburg that Abraham Lincoln, in talking about our government, said 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Notice he used the word proposition. It wasn't proved yet. It probably, as we can see, it still isn't proved yet. It's still a proposition. And I used to tell my students, let's take the sexism out of it, which is kind of difficult. But I said, what he's saying in today's language be all mankind, and womankind goes right along. All mankind is created free. So that's Abraham Lincoln looking at the importance of the Constitution, referring it to protecting the principles, these magnificent principles we will later discuss, not today, but in a later session that were brought out in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Our government was not created in a vacuum. There was no magnificent lightning strike that came down from heaven to the Constitutional Convention and they go, golly gee whiz, let's think of all these great and wonderful things. Let's invent an entirely new form of government. No, it was based upon principles that they already knew, starting with the Magna Carta in 1215. What's the purpose of that? The king does not have unlimited powers. The king was not above the law. You can see an original, if you go to the Salisbury, I remember it, or Salisbury State, Salisbury Cathedral in England, they have an original copy of the Magna Carta that anybody, anytime can walk in and take a look at. We also have a copy of the Magna Carta in the United States, believe it or not. A certain politician by the name of H. Ross Perot bought a copy in the 1990s. I think it's now in the Library of Congress, but originally it was housed, I think, in Texas at one of the universities. The Petition of Right. So we often forget, we talk about our Civil War, and most people know very little about our Civil War, other than maybe they've heard the Gettysburg Address, and they know of Appomattox, where the surrender took place, and they probably know more about Robert E. Lee than Ulysses S. Grant or George Gordon Meade, who actually defeated Robert E. Lee. So, but that said, there was a Civil War in England. And it was a bitter civil war, and it took place between the forces of Parliament and the forces of the king. The king lost, and literally lost his head in the process. Sure. And so prior to that, the beginning is the Petition of Right. What did it mean? So when we look at if you say, okay, Tom, can you show us the English Constitution? The answer is, I can't. The Constitution of the United States is the world's oldest written constitution. But that doesn't mean England doesn't have a constitution, but it's just not all in the same place. And nobody exactly knows what precisely rights they have and rights they don't have, because they are not specifically spelled out. So you have the Petition of Rights. The most significant one was a trial by jury and protection from unlawful imprisonment. What was the king doing? He was throwing his subjects in jail. Remember, it's from subject to citizen, throwing people in jail who never got the opportunity to have a trial and prove whether they were innocent or guilty. Then in 1689, after the English Civil War, and it actually got a little bit worse, because England reestablished the monarchy about 1660 with Charles II. Charles I is the one that lost his head. His son, Charles II, fled and survived in France and Belgium. So he was taken in, but he was basically broke. The English decided, well, they didn't really like this commonwealth that was created. And they said, well, we want to bring the king back because we had some stability. So they brought Charles II back, but limited his powers even more than they had been limited under Charles II or Charles I and James I. Unfortunately, the merry monarch was pretty merry with his mistresses, but not with the queen. Oh, my dear, we have no children. So what happened was, the next in line was his brother James, who took the throne as James II. And James II wanted to return England back to Roman Catholicism. And the citizens didn't put up for that for very long. And basically Parliament said, James II, well, you got two choices. We're going to kill you or you get out of town. And James II thought about it and he says, I think I'm going to get out of town. And so he fled. And England then invited William of Orange, which is basically the Netherlands, and his wife Mary, who was he had married an Englishwoman, and they became King and Queen William and Mary. And so after William and Mary were invited to rule, Parliament said, we're going to put a few more restrictions on there. We don't want to run into this James II thing ever again. And so that became known as the English Bill of Rights, further limiting the monarch's power, strengthening the authority of Parliament. And then you have acts of Parliament, and then you have something called conventions and common law. So our legal system in the United States is based upon English common law. All innocent until proven guilty, English common law. Well, what's the opposite? Well, it's called the Continental System or the Code Napoleon. So England was the only European nation that basically had common law. The rest, because Napoleon dominated it, adopted Code Napoleon. In Code Napoleon, you are guilty until proven innocent. And that's a tough standard to meet. Now, if you think, oh, that doesn't affect us in the United States, guess what? It does. All you got to do is think of this state called Louisiana, named for Louis, King Louis of France. Guess what is still true to this day in Louisiana? You are guilty until proven innocent. So you are not guaranteed that this is, we'll talk about another principle shortly called federalism, where as long as the state's laws do not conflict with the Constitution, state law is supreme. So Washington's laws, as long as they are not in conflict with the Constitution, that's the law of the land. That's why we have different marriage. West Virginia, I think you can get married at 15, maybe younger. That marriage, it will be recognized in all the other states, but that's for a different reason. But Washington certainly wouldn't allow that, and probably not California. So you stop them, but that is the law line. Or you can get a driver's license in West Virginia at 15. That driver's license, a 15-year-old cannot get a driver's license in Ohio at 15. But that driver's license from West Virginia is valid in Ohio until you move to Ohio, okay? At which point then you have to follow the standards of Ohio. But so that's a principle we're going to talk about just a little bit. So the bottom line is, I want you to see, oh, it would help if I tap the right place. There we go. So where did these political ideas, since we did not become a nation in a vacuum, since there was no magnificent lightning strike that came down from heaven and suddenly illuminated all our delegates at the Constitutional Convention, where did they get their ideas from? Well, we're going to look at six philosophers whose ideas were critically important to the founding document, the Constitution. So the first is a guy named Thomas Hobbes. And if you look at 1588 to 1649, okay, that's the time, part of that time was the English Civil War. So he's going to get caught up in that. He is our first scholar of political ideas. He came from a very poor family. He analyzed, so he said, well, what's human behavior? He says it's basically selfish. Everybody's thinking for themselves. So I used to say, well, it's kind of like this. So if you have a Danny DeVito caveman, and all of you know who Danny DeVito is, he's not very tall. Then you've got the Terminator, Arnold Schwarzenegger, the Hasta la vista, baby. Who's going to win a fight between the two? Well, it's going to be Arnold Schwarzenegger every time. So what Thomas Hobbes theorized, and what becomes known as the social contract, is that people they agreed to band together. So 100 Danny DeVitos are going to defeat one Arnold Schwarzenegger. So you see how, so they band together for self-protection, and this becomes, and in so doing, they agree to give up a little bit of their individual freedom in exchange for security. And that becomes known as the social contract. Now, Thomas Hobbes did not give this theory of his a name. The social contract is invented by another philosopher later that we will meet this evening. But Hobbes believed that a monarchy, what's the only type of government Hobbes ever experienced? It was a monarchy. And when that monarchy got overthrown, there was hell to pay for it. And Ultimately, over 200,000 Englishmen lost their lives in the English Civil Wars. And there's an American consequence to that we very seldom think about. That consequence is the winners were called the Roundheads because they had a bowl cut. The losers were the Cavaliers. They were the elites, riding the horses. Well, refugees from England that settled in the North, the Puritans, etc., were frequently Roundheads. They were the winners of the English Civil War. The settlers that settled in the South were Cavaliers, the losers of the English Civil War. So, in some senses, when we come back around to the American Revolution, where you have loyalists fighting Tories, revolutionaries, it's fighting the English Civil War all over again, including the American Civil War, fighting the English Civil War all over again, because the descendants in the South were the descendants of the losers. The descendants in the North, more industrious peoples, were more individualistic, were the winners of that Civil War, and that haunted us at several stages in our history. So, caught in the instability of the English Civil War, Hobbes had to flee for his life. And then, of course, he's going to say, well, since we had such bad times when we didn't have a monarchy, a revolt against government risks a return to the state of nature where might makes right. Now, Abraham Lincoln was well aware of that phrase, and in his Cooper Union speech in February of 1860, the speech that literally made it possible for him to become president, at the end of that speech, he reverses it because he's talking about slavery and he's talking about the immorality and the injustice of slavery. And he says, let me remind you, right makes might. And that phrase, instead of might makes right, it's being right that makes you powerful and being moral and principled. Our second is a gentleman by the name of John Locke. And John Locke, English, also his lifetime bridged some of the English Civil War. He believed that all people were subject to the natural law given by God. He believed that all rational minds would sooner or later to come to understand, just by evolution, come to understand this great principle of natural law. Natural law encouraged the forming of the social contract. So the purpose of the state, meaning England, was to preserve life, liberty, and property. And you go, oh, Tom, that's not quite right, is it? I said, actually, it's very right, and you'll understand why. First of all, the access to power in England was to own property. You didn't have property, you didn't have power. Only 1 out of 10 Englishmen owned property that allowed them political rights. In the colonies, 9 out of 10 people owned property. Suddenly, it's not property that's the access to power any longer. And so that's why you say, well, how did the pursuit of happiness slide in there? Well, I'll show you that in just a little bit when we get to Thomas Jefferson. So what do elections do, argues John Locke? They replay the social contract. So every time you go vote, whether you realize it or not, you are renewing your social contract with the American government, between the American government and the American people. Government power, says Locke, should always be seen as limited, not the all-powerful monarch any longer. Government abuse of power justifies revolution. Sounds like Jefferson, doesn't it? And his best known work is two treatises on government, 1689. Again, the 1689 date becomes important. Why? That's the year after the Glorious Revolution, where England kicked out James II and brought in William and Mary of Orange to become the monarchs. So just after the Glorious Revolution. Our next guy is let's see, well, I'm trying to think what his real name was. He's called the Baron de Montesquieu. I put it down here. It is, yeah, Charles Louis de Seconday. We call him the Baron de Montesquieu, but that was his name. what does he suggest? He says, well, the state needs a so you need a written document. So here we start to come in, the pieces are starting to fall into place. You need a written constitution to limit government power and protect individual rights. And of course, Montesquieu, what type of government did he grow up? Well, he grew up in a monarchy, but the French monarchy had a relatively strong class of nobles who are the only people in France that are capable of contesting the power of the monarch, the nobility. So he has no experience with the working class peoples, but he says only the nobility can check the power of the king and the mob. But even more importantly, so we've got this idea of a written constitution. He says to protect the people from the government, you need to divide the government into three branches: executive, legislative, judicial. Now, he did not suggest giving the judicial any authority over the legislative or the executive. He did not suggest giving the legislative any power over the judicial or the executive, and he didn't see the executive as having unlimited power over the judicial or the legislative. That's where the idea of three branches of government comes from, is this guy, the Baron de Montesquieu. His best known work is called The Spirit of Law, and it is a monotonous, monotonous document to read as he goes into every minuscule aspect of the laws of every government that was written in the world. So it's just an awful document to read, but in it you find these critical ideas. And of course, our founding fathers, many of them, had read Montesquieu. And like I said, there were times when they got into fistfights over should other branches of government have some power over the other two to prevent any branch from becoming too powerful. So we have our next guy, Voltaire. Voltaire is also a pen name. It means lightning. But who's the real guy? Francois-Marie Arouet is Voltaire. And Voltaire will be known when we think of our First Amendment freedoms, we're going to come right to Voltaire. He wrote a novel, Candide, which challenged the notion that everything that happens is for the best. He also mocked the church. And in Roman Catholic France, that's a very precarious thing to do. So guess what? He gets kicked out of France and he settles in England and he begins to admire the English ideal of, well, religious liberty, but the religious liberty of England wasn't all that much liberty because you had to be a member of the Church of England. But if you were a Roman Catholic, you were in serious trouble. So Roman Catholics were persecuted. And of course, that extends to the Irish. Why? Because the Irish were Roman Catholic. So they were seen by they were terrorists as far as England was concerned. And England literally tried to wipe the Irish off the face of the earth and nearly succeeded. So he admires this and relative freedom of the press, relative to you don't dare complain about the king. That's still off the table, but you can express opinions on things that are not necessarily monitored by the government. So Voltaire, what we remember from Voltaire is something he probably never ever said, but it's attributed to him, which is, I may disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. And there's freedom of speech. And some think it was his secretary that actually said that Voltaire said this, but he probably didn't. So he's an excellent example of a philosopher, meaning a thinker of the Enlightenment. And these thinkers of the Enlightenment are so critical to the development of our government. Then we have a very interesting guy by the name of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And he's French. So you see, Montesquieu is French. Voltaire is actually French. Rousseau is French. So from the French, we are borrowing critically important ideas. So he wrote, he is the one that comes up for these ideas that a written constitution is necessary, that government power is limited, and he wrote a book called The Social Contract. And so that's where the idea, the social contract, was not his idea, but he is the first philosopher to give it a name so that everybody agrees upon. This is the type of government that we must have. Now, he was not perfect. He said sovereign power, the power of the state, is the general will of the people and therefore can be unlimited. He trusted that the general will of the people would never move to harm individual citizens, and he was clearly wrong in that. So his critics suggest that he felt lacked a feeling for protecting minority rights, and I think that's absolutely true. Now, this guy was a jack of all trades. He not only had an interest in the ideas of politics, but also in just practically everything else, including child rearing. So he wrote this beautiful book called the Emile, and Emile was his son. And so here he is, the father, the loving father, who anticipates every stage of Emile's life and puts forwards the challenges that are going to help him reach that stage and become a genuinely educated, thoughtful, reflective individual. Now, this same guy that is doing such a wonderful job with Emile also abandoned other of his children who starved to death. So you've got this great contradiction in Jean-Jacques Rousseau that most people don't know about. Then we get to our final person that we're going to talk about tonight, which is Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson is a close follower of John Locke, who never read John Locke. But he did read a guy by the name of George Mason, a very famous Virginia revolutionary who wrote the Virginia Declaration of Rights. George Mason was a neighbor of Thomas Jefferson's. Let me take just a couple of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which was prior to the Declaration of Independence being read. Article number 1. All men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights, of which, when they enter into a state of society, they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity, namely the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. So there, incorporated in that sentence, is the pursuit of happiness. And Jefferson borrowed freely from Mason. That was not considered plagiarism at that time. It was, hey, this is a great idea. And if I write about this great idea, the original author is going to be very happy about that because I'm promoting his ideas. And that's so no one ever accused Thomas Jefferson of posterity. He says, all power is vested in and subsequently derived from the people, that magistrates are their trustees and servants, and at all times amenable to them. Now I'm going to go down to 13 because 13 has particularly relevant to our society today. It is what James Madison, word for word, Article 13 of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, is what James Madison wrote and proposed for the Fourth Amendment, which became the Second Amendment because the first two were not ratified. This is what George Mason wrote and James Madison wrote, that a well-regulated militia composed of the body of the people, trained to arms, is the proper, natural, and safe defense of a free state. Why? That standing armies in time of peace should be avoided as dangerous to liberty, and that, in all cases, the military should be under strict subordination to and governed by the civil power. This is what James Madison proposed as the original Second Amendment. What happened in the Senate? Why did it get changed? We don't know because the Senate did not keep minutes at that point in time. So we know that there was a heated discussion. that many of these words were pared down, and by paring it down the way that they did, it lost the meaning, and the purpose was to prevent permanent standing armies. And it wasn't just any Yahoo off the street that was guaranteed to have a weapon. You had to be part of a trained militia. Why? Because that's how your state defended itself. That and that alone. So our next session will be part 2, our first government, the road to revolution, and it is a laundry list of various ways that England tried to tax us without the consent of the colonists, the Declaration of Independence. And by the way, you should know that we did not declare independence on July 4th. We declared independence on July 2nd. And John Adams said something to the effect, July the 2nd will go down in history. We will celebrate it with fireworks. Annually, we will gather together and huzzah, July the 2nd. And that didn't happen. Nor was the Declaration signed on July the 4th. It was approved on July 4th by Second Continental Congress. It wasn't signed that we know of for months. And it was originally not American scripture. And then finally, we'll talk about, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the Articles of Confederation, but you need to understand the Constitution we have today is our second Constitution. The Articles of Confederation, with many, many flaws, was our first written Constitution. So that's what we're going to examine in the next session. And at this point, I will turn it over, and I'm willing to stay around and answer any and all questions that you would like to throw my way. So the floor is open. Lonnie.
When the Declaration for the Constitution, when it was ratified, you said it took years, but did all the people come together and sign on the same day at the same time, or was it?
Nobody knows. I mean, which document? Articles of Confederation?
No.
Declaration of Independence?
Yes.
Nobody knows for sure. They do know that John Hancock was first. Yes, he was first, and because he was the president of the Continental Congress at that time.
Okay.
But that does not mean, because some people will say, well, he was our first president. No, he wasn't. George Washington was our first president. He was the president of Continental Congress, but it was a weak figure with almost no authority.
With a huge signature.
So it might have been as late as January of 1777 before the Declaration was actually signed. So it was quite a distance.
Dr. Peet, could you just let the folks at home know that if they have a question or this?
Yeah, it's at home. If you have a question, raise your hand. There's an icon for doing that in Zoom, and type out your question in the chat box. And make sure that I know that it exists. I will answer questions that way as well. Yes, well, gentleman with the blue shirt first, and then you're second.
Me?
Yes.
It's probably a little getting ahead of the game, but what were the British doing at this time? And these people meeting in Philadelphia, were they sort of spying on them? Did they?
You got to remember, the war had already started.
Okay.
So on July the 2nd, 1776, was over a year since on the 18th of April of, now I'm trying to think of 75, hardly a man is still alive that remembers that day and that year. So over a year of war had gone along. The Continental Congress had already appointed George Washington, who came to Congress wearing this resplendent blue military uniform and said, it's not like pick me, but that's essentially what he was doing. And in truth, he was probably the only qualified American that could have handled that command. We will see that over and over again. Yes.
Again, to press this a little bit, did the British must have known that the Continental Congress was meeting.
They didn't care.
They didn't care.
No.
Got it.
No, they did, but they were more concerned. Their opinion was that it's all Massachusetts. None of the rest of these colonies care about this crap. It's just Massachusetts. So they were focused on dealing with that. And in fact, that's why it was so important that that Continental Congress met, because it indicated that a lot of people were concerned about the violation of all they were asking for was their rights as English citizens. That's all they wanted. If England would have granted them the same rights, so Benjamin Franklin could sail from Pennsylvania to England and have full English rights that when he returned would then be denied to him. And after a while they figured that out, and the just English government just sloughed them off and said, no, you're represented. We don't have any literal, well, you're virtually represented because the parliament represents all of the colonies and everybody equally. No, it didn't. Yes.
I saw in the portion on Jefferson, the phrase was in there, God-given rights, but was Jefferson not very,
He was a deist, probably. But that does mean that he thought that there was a creator of the universe. So that's why you will see Jefferson referring kind of vaguely to the provider for all of us, and seldom refer to God, almost never refer to Jesus Christ. In fact, is the Jefferson New Testament is he excises all miracles and all quotes of Jesus, and that becomes known as the Jefferson Bible. Yes.
but he was one of the people that put forward the idea of separation of church and state.
Absolutely. In fact, his words were, there needs to be a wall of separation between religion and the state, because he was so concerned about the ill effects, the bickering, the fighting, the disputes, the unnecessary disputes that, Methodists and Lutherans and Episcopalians, and I mean, it was unbelievable. But that's what Benjamin Franklin was saying, that each church thought, well, we're the one that's totally in the right, and as far as you disagree with us, you're wrong. And so, yeah, it complicates matters. Yes.
There's a question from home, but can you repeat these questions because they can't hear?
Sure. If you will somehow.
Really would like to know how much influence Greek philosophers had on the Constitution.
So the question is, how much influence did Greek philosophers have on the Constitution? Much less than the Romans. These guys were Romophiles. They loved Rome. They knew the Romans backwards and they were aware of the Greeks, but in their opinion, so you've got Solon, who's the great lawgiver. They didn't respect Solon all that much because Solon transmitted the law to them and then split. He got out of town. Okay, they didn't respect that. Whereas the Romans, specifically a guy by the name of Publius Publicola, not only brought the laws, he stayed and administered and brought them into being. So later on, we will get to studying what are called the Federalist Papers. And those are 85 documents written that are the best explanation. You want to know how our government is supposed to operate? Read the Federalist. But it is a slog, but it is brilliant. So you've got three authors, James Madison, who wrote 30, Alexander Hamilton, who wrote about 30, Hamilton about 50, and John Jay exactly 5. We know John Jay's, but they all signed off with the pen name of Publius Publicola. Why? Because they knew that everybody knew who Publius was. I had no idea the first time I read it who Publius was. I had to look him up, but that's who he was. And in fact, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton wrote so well that there are at least 5 Federalist Papers that no matter how you analyze it, sentence structure, number of words in the sentences, the words that were used, we don't know who the author was. That's how closely they adopted the persona of Publius Publicola. Not any other, yes.
2 questions. Well, big one, was, you mentioned about the separation of church and state.
Yes.
I had heard, and I'd like you to comment on, that one of the big reasons for separation of church and state was all these religious sects that you talk about. Their leaders said, we don't want the government getting involved because the government, of course, they've been under the Church of England, and they did not want the government picking a winner.
Yes, and nowhere is that better illustrated than in the Northwest Ordinance, which creates, 5 up to 7 states out of the territory north of the Ohio. And in that, they have freedom. They declare you cannot have a state religion. Why? Because they knew that the Lutherans were in favor because they said, oh, we can just come from New York in. And the Congregationalists, we come from Massachusetts. Everybody thought, we're going to restrict religion because we're going to win the battle. We'll get our people in there and our religion will become the de facto religion. So that's what, so yes, they were thinking along those lines of religious conflict, and that we'll win. Wink, wink, wink. We're not making it Lutheran. We're going to win. We Lutherans. Or Congregationalists, or you name it, all the different religions. And there were many, and they were divisive. And George Washington, I should note, understood that also. So he made a point. And Roman Catholics, not only were they discriminated against in England, they were seriously discriminated against in the colonies as well. Only one colony, Maryland, was originally founded as a haven for Catholics, and then quickly Protestants were outnumbering them. So what the Catholics did is they did an end run, which was brilliant. They said, we are declaring that Maryland is a safe haven, even if you're a Protestant. But what the real story was, it was protecting Catholics. So by welcoming Protestants, they were protecting themselves. So the act of toleration in Maryland becomes a way of dealing with that. So religious differences were very important, but obtaining free, and let's keep one other thing in mind. It's not like everyone was a revolutionary during the American Revolution. About 1/3, and John Adams said about 1/3 were revolutionaries. 1/3 were loyalists, and 1/3 didn't care.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, yes. Any other questions? I'll go as long as you want to have, if you want to ask questions. Yes, sir.
This is probably a final one. I wish I had you in high school in your electrical, because your mastery of the subject is amazing. And most history teachers are probably one chapter ahead of the textbook.
Yeah.
But you certainly are not.
But that's accumulation of 30 some years of teaching too, that as I read, I got better and better. And then as Benjamin Franklin said, I discovered that some things that I once thought right were clearly wrong. And I was open to that. Yes.
I think we're about done, and I want to give all of you some homework. Next time you come, we're going to be at the Lutheran Church. I want you all to bring someone else with you, but wasn't this awesome? Yes. Let's say thank you.
Thank you.
No. When they do now. Oh. Hope we see all of you double next time. We need, did you see Jefferson's last comment? When your government isn't taking care of.
Live in this area now?
Yes, yeah.
I live off Mount Pleasant. Okay, you're a Lincoln Scholar. Okay.
Announcement, yeah.
Northern Code.
Let's hear.
Good. Story like this. And these a Lincoln. Uh-oh. I'm sorry.
Okay, Lisa.
Speaking of ability to protest, we're gonna have another sign wave at the corner between 1 and 3, stay 20 minutes, stay an hour, this coming Friday, and we're gonna have signs like this for both Social Security, but also Medicaid, because it's becoming huge. So bring a friend, please show up. Questions?
And the 44+% to the HUD budget is required some state.
Sure.
you know how many people are on Section 8 in public housing?
But not signed.
And this is not case sensitive, lowercase. So I'm talking to you wrong. This is one on judge. Most single was long, it's still cause fast. Somebody made a big issue of what else is. Okay,